Greetings, I'm Rabbi Gail Nord, and I'd like to invite you to session 2 of Qoheleth, a most unusual book, where we, in 6 weeks, are going to come to hopefully a deeper understanding of this fascinating book of the Bible and, in a sense, make it our own, as we always do when we study something new and come to know it in a new way. And also, come to perhaps appreciate the relevance that this work has for our lives today. So I'm just going to briefly, let's introduce this by part of today's reading, which will be chapters 3 and 4. And I do encourage you to have the text in front of you. Do these words sound familiar? To everything there is a season and an appropriate occasion for every matter under heaven. We usually hear that translated, a time for every matter under heaven. Now, of course, that was popularized as the lyrics to the song Turn, Turn, Turn by the Byrds sometime in the 60s when I was a mere child. But we're going to talk about that. It's actually a poem that occurs in the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes. So just a little bit of a step back. This book of Qoheleth falls into the category of wisdom literature in the Bible. It was written circa 300 to 180 BCE, not written by King Solomon, as it sometimes is believed. It's an unknown author who writes in the voice or persona, or maybe this person really was an older, very wealthy, powerful man looking back on his life and ruminating on his experiences and what he learned as a result of those experiences. What perspective does he have on life as he looks back? We can look at this, some commentators look at this as a very negative, depressing look on life. Others see it in a more uplifting way, and I certainly count myself in that category. It's unique in biblical writings. It's philosophical in character, but does not present in any way a structured or coherent system of philosophical thinking. Just a couple of main concepts for you to, again, keep in mind as we read this week. The first is Hevel, or Hevel, depending on if you're Ashkenazic or Sephardic. Hevel is an important word that means something like ephemeral, fleeting. I like vaporous, vapor, without ultimate or lasting significance. We saw this last week in the 2nd verse, which in my translation, the Jewish Publication Society commentary on Ecclesiastes, which I'm reading from today, it says, utter futility, said Qoheleth, utter futility, all is futile. Now, if we want to translate this as vapor, it would be vapor of vapors or something like that. All is vapor. All is without permanence under the sun. Now, here's the second concept, under or beneath the sun, and we'll hear this as a recurring theme throughout Qoheleth. Takat Hashemayim, under the sun or beneath the sun. So that it is if Qoheleth is looking at his teachings in this book are directed to the realm under or beneath the sun, which of course opens up the question, what's above the sun? If there's a beneath, there has to be an above. All right, so let's take a look at chapter 3 of Qoheleth, or Ecclesiastes. And as you recall from this week, Qoheleth is the Hebrew title for this book. Ecclesiastes is the more common English title. They both mean something to do with the assembly, one who addresses the assembly. But Qoheleth is taken as a title and not a personal name. It's like teacher, not like Bob, so to speak. All right, so chapter 3 begins with a beautiful poem, as I indicated before. I'm going to read it through. It's verses 1 through 8, and then I'm going to go back and we'll discuss this in more detail. We had a great deal of fun doing this at class on Wednesday. really thinking about this poem and looking at it in a deeper way. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. Everything in its time. And now the time here is not so much like 4:27 on Thursday afternoon. It's a time more, if you're familiar with the Greek ideas of time, like there's chronos, which is chronological time, and there's kairos, which is like the moment when it's appropriate for something to happen. And this, in my understanding, is the kind of time that's talked about here. So a season is set for everything, an appropriate occasion for every experience under heaven. So things happen at their appropriate time. A time for being born and a time for dying. Now, some of the commentators took this and saw it as there's an exact moment which we are destined to be born, and there's an exact moment when we are destined to die. So our second of dying is predetermined before our birth. Well, there are also a lot of commentators who don't look at it that way, but our passing will occur in its appropriate time, at the time that it occurs. When it happens, and in that sense, it is its appropriate time. Now, there's certainly untimely deaths. I have friends whose children were lost in an untimely way, and this can be a very, very hard word to hear. And certainly we don't understand what this means, and I don't think it means that God wants us to be taken before our time. So just know that. So a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted. Now that could either look like a harvest, a planting and a harvest. It's also sometimes understood as planting as a fresh beginning. The new seed goes into the ground, and then the uprooting could be destruction, or it could also be there's a time for all things in life. There's a time for things to begin, and there's a time for things to end. Sometimes relationships need to end. Sometimes jobs need to end. There's a time that what has been planted does need to be uprooted, and something new needs to be planted. A time for slaying and a time for healing. Well, that's an interesting concept, isn't it? The idea of a time for slaying. Some of these things, and we got into this in our discussion on Wednesday, it just seems it's so difficult to imagine that there is a time for things to be killed or to be slain. Well, those of you who eat meat, that's certainly, we could be talking about animal life here. I'm more on the side of a time for healing. My real job is in healthcare, doing spiritual counseling for those who are having health problems. So a time for tearing down, a time for building up. Well, we can understand that. A time for weeping and a time for laughing. We all have known that, haven't we? There are times in life when our hearts are broken, and there are times when we're filled with laughter and joy. And thank goodness that we have both, really. I mean, God set things in their place for a reason. A time for wailing and a time for dancing. Now, this wailing is understood as the kind of wailing that occurs at a funeral. You've seen videos, perhaps, or experienced Middle Eastern funerals or other cultures where there's wailing, deep keening, moaning as part of the grieving the death. And that's the wailing that's referred to here. So there's that. And then there's a time to dance. You dance at the wedding. You wail at the funeral. A time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones together. Throwing stones. Now, we talked about this quite a bit too. What does that bring to mind? I mean, certainly throwing stones can be a part of kind of an attack mode. We still see that happening in the Middle East, that people are stoned. Um, I also think of my homesteader great grandparents who homesteaded in northern Minnesota, where it was rocky. The glacier had dumped all kinds of rocks right where they happened to get their homestead land. So my grandmother remembered every spring having to go out with her many siblings and pull rocks out of the field. She said it was as if there were just no end of rocks, and they'd end up with big piles of rocks. So who knows? Some of these we just have to kind of take into ourselves and think, well, we don't really know what's referred to here, but it still somehow speaks to us at a deep level. A time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces. That is often understood by the commentators as sexual intercourse, or it's a time for embracing, a time for engaging in that sort of relationship, and there's times for not. Certainly in the Torah, there are laws of purity which say that you should not engage in intercourse during a woman's menstrual period, and not until she's completely free of that and has gone to the ritual bath. So that might be what that possibly refers to. But we can also look at that in a way of our lives today. That there's a time when you want to wrap your arms, and there's times when you just know you need to hold back. A time for seeking and a time for losing. Now, most of us don't like losing things. I certainly don't like misplacing my car keys, which is not an uncommon occurrence in my life. But there are things when we could say something like a fortuitous loss. There are things that we want to lose. We want to lose bad behaviors. Sometimes we want to lose things that are not beneficial to us. Or sometimes we'll lose a job, and only down the road can we say, yeah, that ended up being the best possible thing. So at the time we may grieve the loss of something, be upset by it, but down the road we see that that was actually in our best interest. A time for keeping and a time for discarding. I have a friend who's going through that process of really going through her possessions and realizing that she had much more than she needed, and she's feeling this real sense of freedom as she goes through things that she doesn't need anymore, and gives them away or recycles them. A time for ripping and a time for sewing. The ripping may well refer to the practice of rending one's clothing for mourners at the time of, or as they're going through the grieving process. And that's still practiced in Jewish funerals today in a ritual way. A black ribbon will be pinned on the garment of the immediate family, and that is ripped at the beginning of the funeral service as a statement of blessing is said. A time for silence and a time for speaking. Well, we know that one, don't we? There is a time not to speak, and there's a time when we should speak. And both of those take some discipline and some courage. And we're going to hear more about that in chapter 4 today. A time for loving and a time for hating. Who are we to hate? Now, the Torah tells us that we should hate the enemies of God. That can be a dangerous concept, because if we believe we have the only true answers on what one should believe, or we have the only true relationship with God, that can justify all kinds of cruel and hateful behavior. So we need to be careful about what we love and what we hate. The balance, it's better to walk with hearts of love. But there are things which are bad. There is evil in the world. There are people who make really poor choices and do a lot of harm. Time for war and a time for peace. There you go. When's a time for war? Of course, everyone points to World War II and Adolf Hitler and the terrible damage that he did not only to the Jewish people, but to many peoples who didn't fit into his and the Nazis' model of what human beings should be. So, we hope for peace, but we know the reality. We hope for love, but we know the reality. Beautiful words, and ones that we could ponder every day to our benefit. It goes on. What value then can a man of affairs get from what he earns? From what can we get from the struggle or the toil of life is probably a better translation of that, given that there are these things that they just are. There's a time for this and a season for that and an appropriate time. So what's with the effort in life? Why should we toil so hard in life? Qoheleth says, I have observed the business that God gave man to be concerned with or to busy himself with. He brings everything to pass precisely in its time. God's time is not our time. We know that. But Qoheleth believes that things occur at their kairotic moment, at their appropriate time. He also puts, now this is really interesting, he also puts eternity, is the translation here, in their mind. It's ha'olam, which can be eternity, kind of like the whole of reality, kind of eons, forever. And this may be part of that counterbalance to under the sun. We human beings, as far as we know, have a unique ability to look forward, to look backward, and to envision or imagine or to feel connected with that which is beyond our everyday reality. We somehow have that capacity within us. Now, I don't know if other creatures do. We can't communicate with them in a way that is meaningful enough to know. But certainly human beings have that. We know that there was a time before we're here. We know that we're going to die. 90-some% of people in the U.S. believe that there's something beyond this reality, something they would call God or ultimate reality or something. I mean, there are definitely people who think that this here and now is all there is. It's a tough position to hold, I think, for any number of reasons. But as Qoheleth says, God put this sense of something larger into our mind. But without man ever guessing from first to last all the things that God brings to pass. So here's the rub. We have this sense of something greater, of some larger purpose, of God doing these things at the appropriate time. But do we know what it's all about? No. We have no clue, really, at the end of the day, what the ultimate purpose of our existence or anyone else's existence is. That is not revealed to us in this lifetime. There's a great quote in the New Testament that says, in this lifetime, so to speak, we see as in a mirror darkly, but then, meaning in the next life or whatever comes after this, we will see face to face. We see as in a mirror darkly, but now we see face to face. More beautiful poetry. All right, thus I realized, Qoheleth realizes that the only worthwhile thing is for them to enjoy themselves, so speaking of people, and do what is good in their lifetime. So enjoy what you have and do good. I can't think of a better prescription for life than that. Just be content, be grateful, and do all the good that you can every day that you're alive. Also, that whenever a man does eat and drink and get enjoyment out of all his wealth, it is a gift from God. So remember that everything we have, even though we look at it as we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps and earned what we have, really I didn't bring myself into being. I don't know where I came from or why I'm here. I don't know why I have the abilities I have or have been given the opportunities I have or have had the challenges that I have gone through. But I trust that it is all from the hand of God, which helps us to accept the tough times in life, but also helps us to be humble in the face of the things that are good or we perceive to be good or gifts that we have. Okay, he goes on. I realize too that whatever God has brought to pass will recur evermore. We talked about this last time, that there are these cycles that go on and on, nothing new under the sun. Nothing can be added to it, nothing can be taken from it. And God has brought to pass that men will revere him, to fear him. That there's a purpose to this. What is occurring occurred long since. What is to occur occurred long since. Okay, we heard this back in chapter 1. And God seeks the Well, it says the pursued. Um, One commentary I read, and I like this very much, it says God seeks the persecuted, because we're going to get into a conversation about injustice. And he goes on, he says, and indeed, I have observed under the sun. It says in here, alongside justice, there is wickedness, but I prefer in the place of justice, there is wickedness. Okay, in the place of justice. So there should be justice, but there's wickedness. In the place of righteousness, there is wickedness. I'm mused. God will doom both the righteous and wicked, for there's a time for every experience and for every happening. So I decided, as regards men, to disassociate them from the divine beings and to face the fact that they are beasts. For in respect of the fate of the man and the fate of the beast, they have one and the same fate. As the one dies, so dies the other, and both have the same life breath, the same ruach. Man has no superiority over beasts, since both amount to nothing. Our lives in this under the sun both go to the same place, both came from dust, and both return to dust. Who knows if a man's life breath does rise upward and if a beast's breath does sink down into the earth? Do we know? Do we know? Absolutely not. We don't know. We just know what we have here. I saw, therefore, that there is nothing better for man than to enjoy his possessions, since that is his portion. For who can enable him to see what will happen afterward? I believe Qoheleth is telling us, be in the moment. Be where you are. Be grateful for what you have. Enjoy what you have. And really, don't worry over much about what's to come in the future, because we don't know. I mean, if you look at your life, any 5-year period, look back 5 years, would you be necessarily imagining where you are and what you'd be doing today? I wouldn't. But, so just enjoy what is. It doesn't mean we shouldn't plan for the future, but don't focus over much on it. Chapter 4. So he goes into now more about social injustice. I further observed all the oppression that goes on under the sun, okay, Takat Hashemesh, the tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. It's so tender. So Qoheleth is observing this oppression and saying what really bothers him. The oppression it's going to be. It just is always going to be part of human life. But what breaks his heart is the tears, and no one's comforting them. That's just, it's so dear. The power of the oppressors with none to comfort them. So maybe that's part of our goodness, is to comfort the oppressed, even if we can't necessarily change the circumstances, to be there to comfort. Then I accounted those who died long since more fortunate than those who are still living. Life is hard, and happier than either those who have not yet come into being and have never witnessed the miseries that go on under the sun. He really takes these things very seriously. He takes them to heart. I've also noticed that all labor and skillful enterprise come from men's envy of each other. Another futility and pursuit of wind. I want a bigger car. I want a bigger house. I want a better job. I want to be prettier and smarter. You can waste a lot of your life's energy comparing yourself to other people. I remember telling my kids when they were young, my kids are, of course, they're my kids. I think they're wonderful. But they're good kids. But one of them, I don't remember who or the circumstance, was comparing themselves with someone else. I said, there's always going to be somebody who's smarter, prettier, has more stuff, succeeds more, has more money. There is. It's just inevitable. But if you spend your time comparing yourself, you're going to always be miserable. Whereas if you accept who you are and make the most of that and use it for the good, you'll always be happy and content. I've also, okay, I already read that. The fool folds his hands together and has to eat his own flesh. Kind of like the fool brings himself to destruction. Better is a handful of gratification or contentment than 2 fistfuls of labor, which is a pursuit of wind. And I have noticed this further, futility under the sun. The case of the man who is alone with no companion, who has neither son nor brother, yet he amasses wealth without limit, and his eye is never sated with riches. For whom now is he amassing while denying himself enjoyment? This too is a futility in an unhappy business. So now he says something else, the value of companionship. Two are better off than one in that they have greater benefits from their earnings. For should they fall, one can raise the other. But woe betide him who is alone and falls with no companion to raise him. There's an oppression that would bring you to tears. Further, when two lie together, they are warm, but how can he who is alone get warm? Also, if one attacks, two can stand up to him. A threefold cord is not readily broken. Now, this is a line I often use in weddings when I officiate at weddings. A threefold cord is not readily broken. So we're talking about two here. What's number three? Well, it's understood to be a relationship with God. So if the couple are bound together and also include that spiritual depth and relationship in their relationship, they will be strong. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer has a sense to heed warnings. For the former can emerge from a dungeon to become a king, while the latter, even if born to kingship, can become a pauper. I reflected about all the living who walk under the sun with that youthful successor who steps into his place. Every king and queen has a successor in the wings. They know they won't rule forever. Unnumbered are the multitudes of all those who preceded them, and later generations will not acclaim him either. For that too is futile and a pursuit of wind. Our last verse for today. Be not overeager to go to the house of God. More acceptable is obedience than the offering of fools, for they know nothing but to do wrong. So we're encouraged not to put our whole emphasis on worship for worship's sake. Don't be just overeager to run there. More acceptable is to be obedient, to be kind, to be good, to love your neighbor. All right, that's it for today. I hope that you'll join me again next week for session 3. And please feel free in the comments section on YouTube to ask any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. All right, shalom.